Voyage of the Honor-Bound by Angelee Sailor Anderson. Read by Stanley Anderson. Man that is in honor and understandeth not is like the beasts that perish. Psalm 49, verse 20. Part 4. Honor-Bound. Across my foundering deck shone a beacon, an eternal beam. Gerard Manley Hopkins. The Wreck of the Deutschland. Chapter 31. Passage. The visions of 40 centuries were rolled back over her. On the wave crest of the spirit whose fire she had not felt since the crossing of her heart's love to black, there was borne back to her the prophecy of a mystical child, fulfilling its journey from the beginnings of her body to behold other shores, to move nations' laws and men's immortal souls. She felt once more the handclasp of sisterhood from a wooden lady, saw again the garden's glory she had glimpsed in her brief passage through death. She could not purge from her thought the image, yearning surfaceward from bottomless depths of her drowning hands. It was this that had led her to seek the rock-bound pool at what would have been dusk had the sun still held sway. The time of her nightly ritual had the ritual retained purpose. The banyan she need no more guard, for its catastrophe was come, done. She feared to bathe herself in the steaming waters with her berthing so near, but the image of her hands writing them and sweetly sinking had lured her to them by torchlight kindled from the night lamp of Rani. There, through a veil of chalice vines and cercia flowers, she had seen a man in native dress lying face down at the water's edge, sleeping, dead, or immersed in imponderable grief. Almost she had gone to him, but then, never more, except he will come to me, she had remembered, and she had departed without making herself known. For his sake 40 weeks since, she had let the flame of the memorial of the others die for good. Through all those weeks she had left the niche where it had once burned unvisited. But now, with the return of the spirits speaking to her, there came also the last whisper of Rani, "Remember the others." Remember the others. How, with the fruit of millennia's tears straining at her belly, could she forget? And yet the words, with their foundering hands, and the hands of wood, and the garden's fragrance, troubled her, and she had come to the rock wall that barred the sacred peninsula to fathom them, and to learn whether the intercession of Brian David would be in time. Laurie stood before the niche and the dead flame, holding dying Tara in her arms. She heard the murmuring of the waters deep entombed, and prayed to see their light once more before the last backlash of the long rain overwhelmed her. From the south and east away she heard a call, the voice of Clement uttering sentences of moment in his own language and without meaning for her but for the name of Dominic. Their passage through her was like that of the voices of the rocks through one who is not an oracle, wonderingly beautiful and of infinite mystery. They coaxed the scents and sounds of the garden nearer, beckoning her within. The sounds, the scents, within. The night was half spent. Laurie flowed back on the current of her trance to the present instant and her own foundation of ground. She flowed back, but scent and sound raced on the current with her. The scent she knew best of any, cavern-housed, night-blooming. The sound was of life, heard through gateways standing open. Before her, beneath the memorial of the others, stood the low entrance to the sacred way, no longer hidden. From behind her beat upon the door a golden blaze that made her torch slip from her hand in needlessness. Shuddering with joy, she turned to the passionate revelation of the salamander's fire-formed eyes. Slowly, for the awkwardness of her body and added burden of terror, she fell to her knees. "My lord messenger of Kyalari," she cried, "you come to me at last." It spoke no word in answer, but moved closer to her and closer. She felt the fierce, exquisite heat of it as it passed by and through the first of the spirit gateways, leaving a gleaming trail behind. Laurie rose, stooped, and entered after it, hastening as best she could. Her spirit rushed on in ecstatic expectation. Its speed was that of the steeds of Kyalari, the passage through the rock spinning away behind her like a world abandoned for its empyrean, the messenger of the fire, an altar of flame upon its highest hill. In her flesh she crept so slowly that nearly she lost sight ahead of the salamander at each slight curving of the way, yet always it stayed just within her eye's reach. For the impatience of her spirit the tunnel seemed to run on forever. For the sloth of her limbs only her own weariness seemed infinite. The night wore on, and she grew wearier, and Tara cried weakly all the time. And then there came a moment when she could no longer see the messenger before her, and her legs would no longer support her. She pulled herself with one arm along the trail of gold, a few inches, a few more. Slumber quenched her struggle with dreams in which night-blooming Sirius was tinged with salt, and the fountain's lone chant was answered by choruses of waves. Though hours, as dreams defined them, drifted past, it was not long before she woke. She lay within a palace-sized cave that opened upon the ocean, whose waves lauded the creation of color in more shades of turquoise and indigo, azure and cerulean, and ultramarine than man's conception of blueness could conceive. The sun was just risen over the northern shore of the sacred peninsula, and the messenger framed against it was the brighter of the dawns. The oracle saw what she knew she ought to have known without seeing. No plague of night could approach the holiest things of Kyalari, no shoot of a darkling tree. The strength of light itself surging into her, she wrapped Tara, no longer crying, closer against her heart. Before she went on through the second gate, not with any sorrow, Lari wept. His hair and clothes were wringing with sweat. Sweat dripped into his eyes that would not stop tearing. He swallowed continually to keep from drooling down his chin, but it was hard when his throat felt tight as if a noose constricted it. Already he had vomited several times. He wondered how many more moments it would be till he could no longer feel his limbs, till his skin turned blue as the fountain. His stung heel was a goad that helped him onward, for when he walked it seemed to pain him less. The messenger's trail gave him courage as he touched it, and he drew courage too from his years, 20 today, of faith in his purpose and the one who purposed. That purpose in its earthly manifesting was dawning to conclusion. Soon he would be able to follow no longer. But it was his choice not to rest suffering till he died, but to die indeed. He had traced the guiding gold from the south eaves of the rainforest to the rocks of hearing. Now he paused to feel within his boot his mother's letter, ensuring himself that the pouch in which he kept it protected it from his poison-summoned sweat. He croaked out a prayer to her where she interceded for him among the saints, that he might see Lari's child before his end. The trail ran on to the last of the rocks and to the crossing. Brian gazed out over the black water to the gap beyond, thinking he dimly saw the downward stairway to the fountain of life, expecting almost to see the wake of the salamander spanning the crossing, redeeming the curse, making the waters well. But the trail continued to a wall of rock overgrown with flame flowers, and the threshold of a door, and he lurched along it, growing ever sicker and weaker. Through the door outward poured the most blissful of anodynes, smell of blooms thriving to perfection on the fountain's kiss of sound, a kiss with nothing barring it from reaching to his own cheek and expunging his memory of his father's fist from the record of sins. On the threshold he found a castaway torch. He knew that so far his sacrifice had accomplished its intent, that his prayer and the command of the messenger to follow pointed the same way. He allowed Lari to lead him in passage, not wholly blind as once before, but held straight by a filament of grace glimmering at his feet. Dominic could not tell how long he had lay, hearing the voice of Marielle, where it bled through the cracks in that singing he could never reach, where it wept like sorrowing bells, bewailing his dying daughter. The ache of his bite wounds and of his banyan-scratched cheek had subsided to make room in his awareness for the aching within. He ached for mother and child. He ached for the fountain and its secret, but not now that he might possess them. He ached with the sheer being of them, with the mere knowing that they were. And he ached for Lari. Something had changed in him in the hours or days of his passage through pain cloaked in music. He could not name it, but he could trace it in its result. The oracle whom he had despised and rejected, even she was now the thing he wanted, not in self-will, but as a newborn wants its mother's breast. And the passage had taken him further from himself than this. He sensed that at its end it might lead him to acts he could not have dreamed before. Even now could not see clearly enough to choose. But now he could begin with what he knew, that he must find Lari. And having found her, he would see what he would see. He had no inkling where she was. He rose from the ledge of the pool and began to walk in the direction of the women's huts as best he could ascertain it. At length he came upon one and entered it, and knew at once that it was the hut of Ronnie. The scent of her had belonged to him too intimately not to recognize. But the hut housed another scent that made his heart turn cold. He groped along the pandanus mats, fearing what his fingers would touch, until he reached the tappa sheet that was her bed. Here the smell of death was strongest, but his shaking hands encountered no corpse. They found rather the coat of his uniform, drenched indelibly with the perfume of her who had worn it for so long, who would not, he knew, have shed it until she shed the reason for any raiment but the grave's. He pressed the coat to his face. "Ronnie," he moaned. "Oh Christ, how have I broken you?" He lost himself in a new aching, for this other mother and her offspring most miserable, whether dead with her or with its father miserably alive. He wondered if all life were not but a reenacting of one's first mistake. He was roused by the voice of friendship, long neglected, near forgotten, not known how dear till now. It did not mock, prick, or rebuke him, as was its charitable wont, but its voice was rather the mystic's wind, the voice of spirits, perhaps of the very muse of the fountain, third of a trinity in which he had no faith. "The secret, Dominic. I have heard it. I will be waiting." Dominic laid the coat back on Ronnie's bed. "Wait, Clement," he said softly, "as this hangman's hood, rank of my earning, must wait till I come for it again. Let all the voices that have the right of demand over me wait with patience, for there is a thing I must do before I attend to them, before I acknowledge them all. I must follow first the nearest voice that calls, and I must listen, and I must think. First comes the first reconciliation, first the vision of blue shed into blindness. The majesty of Kyalari must have its due, and then I do not know." Leaving the hut, he struck out into the forest, west and north, going to Lari, though he did not know where he went. As he walked, he bound up again his hair. Chapter 32. Sown among flowers. The trumpets of heaven had swallowed her feet. Breezes blew through their blueness to make hymns that ascended from her buried ankles to her hips and up the whole length of her. Never could she recall feeling more glad. On her left hand rose the deep green swells under which the sanctuary of the goddess lay hidden. On her right hand swelled the sapphire of the endless ocean. Consecrated nature delighted her every sense, her eyes with shape and tint, her ears with rustle and rush, her face with moist coolness, and her feet with warmth of sand, her nostrils and tongue with the essence of the sea, ever the sea. The rocks strewn amid the blossoms through which she waded were not treacherous to her, nor did the weight of new life without and within cast her spirit down. Tara, bound against her left side with an ear to her heart, sighed in tune with the hymning of the flowers and in rhythm with her pulse. Almost Lari forgot whose child she was. Almost the babe seemed a shard of her own self on this her voyage in the awful wake of a minister of fire. But then a droplet of blood would trickle from her throat to her breast and the babe, and once more she would be aware. There was no ebb and flow of time in her trek through the morning glories, no variation between one footfall and the next. Her supernal peace was a continuance that nothing it seemed would ever break. Yet at length, midway through the trumpets, she was informed of change. At first she could not perceive what the difference was. Then it came to her that she no longer heard Tara's sigh. She looked down, and the infant looked back. Lari had not seen her eyes till now. They were deep and they were dark, but they were not the eyes of Ronnie. They were, beyond all questioning, her father's eyes. Through Tara, Dominic's eyes linked with Lari's, and Lari paused in her progress, feeling that her heart had also paused, perhaps perpetually. Then with a final sigh the child's eyes closed, sown in the sod of earth to bloom in the garden beneath a mother's care. Lari sank to the sand. Too slow these feet, too slow, she wept. "Oh, Ronnie, I am sorry." She kissed Tara's forehead and cradled the tiny face in her hand, wondering how she was to bury her. She could not take her out to sea. She might perhaps have piled stones over her if she had been more strong. She could not leave her here uncovered, but to carry her to the fountain dead was more than she could bear. She saw the salamander turning back to her. With stately majesty it retraced its track, until it was so near that its hot breath rekindled the forge of her failing heart. With its mouth it lifted Tara and laid her on the sand beneath a blue-petal shroud. One by one it gathered the brightest of stones and built a cairn above her. When there remained but one stone to place, it conveyed the whitest of them all into Lari's hands. Laurie completed the monument, and the messenger turned westward toward the fountain again. Laurie huddled before the cairn, not following, doubting if indeed she could go on. Noon arrived and departed. The salamander approached the horizon of her sight and commenced to cross. She heard a disturbance in the tranquillity of the shallows, and she saw the messenger of the water skimming the low waves near the shore. Its voice came to her as on a day 4,000 years before. "I will bear you again, Laurie, if I must." "If I must," repeated Laurie, and it seemed to her that the shark had appended silently, "Must I?" She bestirred herself and stood to her feet. "Thank you, Lord," she answered, "but there are others who may come after that will need you more than I." She pressed on through the flowers, in sadder peace, yet peace still, looking back but once at the resting place of Terra. At last she reached the land of twilight, saw the salamander far before her, processing through uncanny spires of stone. She felt unwearied, fully ready for this gateway, and the 5 ahead in her returning to the first act of life. But as she stepped across the twilit border, the birth pangs of a life only half her own came upon her. He had not known how great a share of joy was committed to his memory. His heathen captain had not retrieved the book on that one brief return to its cabin home, and his own feet had not borne to leave the sanctity of the island's soil long enough to claim it. In times of need, or in times when his thought was occupied with nothing else, huge passages would rise up before his eyes as though he saw them verily, exact to the minute variations in script, the placing of the stains upon the well-worn pages. He had held the book dear to him, and it repaid him by remaining near to him in spirit, though his hands, lovers of its frayed binding, were far away. His need for it now was great. He had the golden thread to guide him through the dark rock, and he had the conviction of his purpose, but his ever-failing flesh betrayed his mind into paying it all his need, into studying every muscle and vein to learn the precise degree of their deterioration. Each wave of nausea, each bead of sweat, each pain at his lungs and his heel was marked down in an autobiography of fatal diagnosis, and the trace of numbness that newly plagued him was noted as beginning of the end. If he was to continue, he must will his mind to rivet upon something else, something that would use the whole of it till no energy remained to chart the course of his dying. It was now that a vision of the book came to him. Maybe, thought Brian, if I put all my strength into remembering, if I choose something that I'll not remember easily, that I can think on for a good while without coming to the conclusion of it, perhaps if I trace a thing at random and trace it through the old part and the new, all the places where the flood is mentioned, nay, I know those too well, the sea passages, that is neither hard enough. All the verses that have to do with stars or with sowing and with seeds. Think, Brian, seed, aye, Genesis, the 3rd chapter, verse 15. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and he shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Bruise his heel, or sting it, maybe. But your head was more than bruised, it was crushed entirely, you minister of Satan. Nay, there I go thinking on myself again. Sowing. Isaiah, chapter 32, I think. Blessed are ye that sow beside all waters. And so his mind occupied itself with words, and his eyes with gilden light, and his dying tale seemed suspended, and the passage seemed short. But at last there was impressed upon him another thing he could not ignore. It also was light, not the trails, but a light shimmering blue, far ahead and widening. It was the light of day, no banyan shadowing. Not waiting to wonder how he could so exert himself at the point of near expiration, Brian broke into a run, and ran until the most glorious of caves was all around him, and before him water of a color he had never seen except perhaps in Laurie's eyes. The blueness, he breathed. Crucified one, if the fountain is bluer than this, I'll look on it and die. And walking through the second of the spirit gateways, he thought on what he had said, and knew it for a prophecy, knew that as love was where he went, there was no fear. From the mouth of the cave he turned from the sea to the more ethereal blue of flowers, yearning toward the quest's completion, for which his story was writ, bluest of all. Dominic had come as far as the rocks of hearing before the meaning of the water's closer sound dawned on him. Briefly he ceased to breathe with the shock of knowing that the door he had spell-coaxed and groped for in vain stood open. More than this, he knew that through that door was Laurie, for the woman was the fountain, whose essential wisdom had baptized him in her person on the night he had taken her and turned quickly away. He could not doubt where he was, for he heard the rocks murmuring like that of no terrestrial voices. But strike out north from them as he would, he could not find the door or the wall that framed it, but came ever back and back to the rocks as though they were the end of all paths. Once he had sought them in their oracle, feigning desire for words he wished truly not to heed. Now that he desired their words indeed, he was certain that in just retribution they would never speak to him. "Kyalare, hear me," he called out desperately, and as he stood in surrender, unhelped by other hope, he began among the preternatural conversing to catch words he could decipher. His mind spun dizzily in the overthrowing of its expectations, for the more words he caught, the more he knew that he had heard them already. What the voices of the rocks murmured in answer was the parable of the sower and the seed. He had read it in his own book, as he had read all the words that were written there, and he had read into the parable his own interpretation having to do with the barren or fruitful wielding of power, for the book's unorthodox editor had omitted the first interpreting by the Christ to his disciples. The rocks did not omit it, and he wondered according to its symbolism what manner of hearer he was, uncomprehending, rootless, illusion-choked, or bearing meaning back to its initiator an hundredfold. Thinking on what he heard more, another voice, solitary, earthly. It was the voice of Brian reverberating as from underground, and it said, "The seed of evildoers will never be renowned." "Brian, Brian David, can you hear me?" Dominic cried, but he sensed that the voice was reaching him from far, far off. He wasted no thought before turning the way from which it seemed to come. "A wicked man walketh with a perverse mouth," the voice went on. "He winketh with his eyes, he speaketh with his feet, he teacheth with his fingers, he deviseth mischief continually, he soweth discord." At the word discord, discordant in his ears, Dominic stood before the door. He discovered the entrance with his hands. "Brian David," he cried again, but as he stepped into the passage, he understood that by some trick of sound, aberration, or miracle, the boy's words were permitted to be carried to him, but not his own to be borne back. Silently listening, he followed them through darkness, no darker to him than day. He blessed the voices leading every moment, though it seemed to enumerate to him all his sins. "I have broken thy yoke, and burst thy bands, and thou saidst, I will not transgress," it moaned, "when upon every hill and under every green tree thou wanderest, playing the harlot. Yet I had planted thee a noble vine, wholly a right seed. How then art thou turned into a degenerate plant of a strange vine unto me?" Thus it condemned him unknowing, and as he proceeded it affirmed the curse of the island goddess in the words of Moses, no mean magician, no magician at all. "I also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, and the burning fever, that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of heart. And you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it." Truly my eyes have been consumed, thought Dominic, and the brow of my firstborn child burns with fever. Wholly defeated, what enemy can further waste my seed? Life I have fought for not knowing what it was, and my too familiar enemy is death. Let it not be so. Kyalare, spare my babes that have done no wrong. "Thou fool," the voice replied, "that which thou sowest is not made alive, except it die. And that which thou sowest not that body that shall be, but a bare grain. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body, and there is a spiritual body. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul, but the last Adam was made a life-giving spirit. But I have sown in power and risen in weakness, but the last Dominic is the same as the first. Or is he? Be not deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. In Mariel I have sown and reaped in scarlet. In Ronnie I have sown and reaped in black. I have sown in the oracle of the Spirit, and what have I reaped? What offspring of confusion, what impossible resolution of opposing poles will she bear me? Their seed shall be known among the nations, and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them shall acknowledge them, that they are the seed whom the Lord hath blessed. Blessed, but ever seen by me the Father? If only I could weep the swinging shadow away. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Come again, from where came I? I have known once before, for Mariel has told me. We have a daughter, Dominic. I have named her Scarlet. Please. He felt the sea wind upon his face, felt wetness beneath his feet. He walked through a mighty hall, a place of spirit's transition, and the last of Brian's voice that lingered there echoed this Amen. Sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, till he come and rain righteousness upon you. Dominic stepped from the cave into warm, gentle rain. Turning westward, without other direction of ears or eyes, the heart of the seeker led him on, for it was time, by 14 years too long. Chapter 33. The Fern Grotto. Laurie crossed into the western twilight, her eyes wet with pain. The salamander was a remote speck of flame at the twilight's farther border, too distant to call for help. The shark's help she had forfeited for the help of others. She was yet many paces from the grotto of birth, and she knew that she could not go on so long. Not since her only lover had completed their intimacy with the stroke of his hand had she felt so alone. She was alone with a stranger demanding release from her womb, demanding it in a place of sunset dreams, not entirely of earth. No dew-damp ferns here to fan and shade her, no mystic sling woven in hibiscus to ease her labor and coax her babe from her gently, according to the intent of Kailare. No blessed fountain stream upon her child's new face, for after birth she would be yet too weak for that journey. In the bitterest of ends she might arrive, but once appropriating the life for which she had come, she knew not what meaning remained for her heir or herself to which to return. Her pain grew harder. "Ai, Kailare," she groaned. And in the midst of her groaning she beheld the swift grace of their limbs, heard the wild joy of their whinnying, smelled again the equine sweetness of their breath after centuries of deprivation. The steeds kissed her hair one by one, even the whole herd. Then they formed a rank behind her along the twilit border, each stamping once and shaking its mane. Each began to breathe more deeply than the oracle had ever seen creature breathe before. In the weird landscape before her there began to be a distortion, and she thought for a moment that the horses were blowing the twilight away. Then she saw that they did not exhale, but breathe in, sucking up the dusk, bending space. The messenger of fire, though it continued walking southward, was drawn nearer. All the fantastic monoliths of stone came crowding toward her. The steeds devoured the twilight, compacting the strand of the world in which they were visitors. In a moment the far border of the twilight was but a step before her, though the near was yet but a step behind, and the salamander was close enough for her to touch. Knowing how it might sear her, yet willing to be so seared, Laurie laid a hand upon its flank and looked back. The horses ceased inhaling, let their breath flow again outward. All in a row they rushed away from her, the twilight unrolling like a scroll after them. Then she turned toward the south and saw them no more. She and the messenger whose burning blood coursed under her fingers stood beneath the last arch at the westward ingress of the Isle of Sighing Trees. Though it wither her body to ash and her child with it, she had no choice but to drape herself along the creature's back and let it carry her. For a time she was aware of nothing but intense heat mixed with pain, mingled with the harmonies of the branches that had shielded her from the flood in the end to permit this present heat and pain. Then at last the salamander tenderly eased her from off it. It had brought her to the 5th gateway, leading into the sanctuary of Kailare. At the grotto the sanctuary's caverns began, sheltering the place of birth overhead on 3 sides, yet leaving it open to the light of the sinking sun. Everywhere were ferns, giants that ranged far above Laurie's head, miniature ferns that overspread the cavern floor, ferns as delicately intricate as snowflakes, ferns of every conceivable green. Moisture, cool but not cold, rose from the ground, as it had once in all places before the long rain. Everywhere there was the noise of waterfalls and streams, though they were hidden from the eye, and all the water sounds were tributary to the waters of the fountain. Laurie stumbled toward one of the birthing slings that hung between the ferns, woven of bark, red hibiscus still blooming in among it. The sling received her, and though her pain did not cease, her body knew at once that thus and thus only was its travailing meant to be. For the sling cherished her as she wished to be cherished by the begetter of her child, and had never been. Cherished her beyond this, as Kailari cherished her herself, himself, each in the other, and all in all. Yet even amid her travail, and the cherishing that sweetened it, Laurie's heart reminded her to wish that Dominic, the first and father in the emerging trinity of which she was a part, were nigh her, his lips a balm of strength upon her furrowed brow. Then at last he too was forgotten in the strange, wondrous cataclysm of her flesh. No longer could Brian keep his feet, nor hardly any longer feel his legs at all. Reeled in like a hooked fish by a line of gold, his flesh was now less the tint of that trail than of the trumpets through which he was dragged. Rocks scraped him underneath and alongside, but he paid no heed to them or the slowing blood they drew, only that he might move one more measure of his own body ahead, and then one more, and at length he came upon a gathering of many stones together. He knew at once why they were there, and he was nearly defeated then, but he looked his grief squarely in the face as he had always done, and found hope not wholly gone. It is only one of two, he told himself. The sting is not vain yet, but he felt like Christ dying between the two thieves, wishing that both might be with him in paradise that day. There remained no moisture for him to cry, but Brian laid his head upon the cairn, whose stones were yet warm from the mouth of the salamander, and gold-streaked but for the topmost, which was cool and perfect white. He thought of Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes, who at Bethel, with stones for his pillow, dreamt of a stairway into heaven with angels traveling up and down along it. He turned his head northward to the sea. There, blue eye to blue eye with him, was the shark. "Soon we will take the way together, Brian David," it said. Soon, but not yet. And it retreated from his vision beneath the waves. "Not yet," sighed Brian hazily, "but soon. Wait for me, Tara, for I'd love to go hand in your hand." He raised his head from the cairn, and summoning a strength that was not his, dragged himself on. Some time later he woke, not having known that he was sleeping. At first he thought he had only dreamt going on, that his headrest was yet of stone. But as his eyes struggled into focus, he found himself in a state to which no dream could have brought him. His hinder parts were among the morning glories and late afternoon light, but a mystery running through the middle had cut him clean in half. Bisecting him, stretching long and wide before him, was evening twilight, but twilight such as the planet's own sun had never made in withdrawing. Dreadful yet eerily beautiful, it beckoned him on to entire absorption in itself, the conflict between it and the part of him still claimed by day nearly tearing him in two. Believing that he hallucinated in death's extremity, Brian wormed his way across the border. The twilight now that he was in it was not twilight at all, but brilliant sunbeams filtering through quivering leaves of a garden. The heart of the garden into which he faced was almost that of the island's rainforest, yet these vines were more lush, these fruits more ripe, these perfumes more exotic to the breath. It was the island, and yet it was not, and a banyan stood guarding the way to the garden's depths, but the tree cast no shadow. Then out from around its trunks walked 3 persons he knew, Nika, Ronnie, and Tara, and the latter was no babe but a woman, though there was a newness in her eyes as of one but lately created. They walked to where Brian lay and bent over him, and Ronnie kissed him once upon the lips, but there was nothing of a lover's kiss in it, and it burned. "Not yet, Brian David," she said. "There is a thing yet to do." Pressing her hands against his shoulder and cheek, she rolled him over, and as he faced the other way, he found himself looking into another world, or not another, but a second heart of the same. It also was the opening of a garden, but this was a garden with a wooden gate, such as might belong to any cottage in his own nation, and the trees and flowers he glimpsed within were native to that land, though here grown to a perfection never achieved there but by the most careful training hand. For all his long romance with Polynesia, Brian knew that it was the heart of this garden to which his own heart was wed. From out of its gate walked another three he recognized from long, long ago. The first was a man he had served often in the tavern in which he was brought up, a man who had been cruel to him and slandered the goodness of the Saviour when he was drunk. But there was nothing of cruelty or blasphemy in the man's face now. The second was an ill-tempered sailor from his first ship, the very one who had tripped him and brought down upon him the captain's wrath. The man raised a hand in greeting, his eyes lit by a smile. And the third, Brian could not be sure, for his sight was deserting him, as it, with the powers of hearing and speech, were wont to do in dreams when they were most needed. It seemed to him that the third was his father. He prayed that it was so, but he was not now to know, for the man's form melted into mist even as he approached, bearing a fist that held no anger but necessary love. "Not yet, Brian David," he said. "You must go back." And the man struck him on the cheekbone as Brian had struck Dominic, even with the same blow. Pain shocking him to life again, Brian opened his eyes and nearly fainted with a second shock. He lay upon his back amid the twilight, and around him, breathing aromatic breath upon him from huge nostrils that hovered too near, were horses, the largest he had seen, russet alternating with black in their ring. Stopping his own breath with fear, they leaned yet nearer and began to nuzzle him. And he remembered then the sacred steeds of the goddess of which Laura had told him, only half the worlds and half heavens, only half the twilights and half the gardens. But then, he did not know how, he was on the back of one of them, gripping with weak knees, clinging to its mane with senseless fingers. His head resting against the steed's neck, he was borne at a canter through the never-ending dusk, and even in his vertigo and the fragility of his consciousness that lapsed at whiles, Brian witnessed to the awe of that region through which they went. Up from the sand, swathed in the light of a sun eternally dying, rose gargantuan flutings of stone, like stalagmites in an invisible cave, pillars upholding a hall whose ceiling was too far skyward to be seen. The stones, the sand, the tide that strangely shifted in obedience to no moon, were all dyed in purple and red, and ever and anon the steed passed through archways standing half in and half out of the ocean, leading into nothing but more of the same. There was a pungent taste upon the air and upon his tongue, myrrh mingled with wine. Then he lost awareness for a time, and when he regained it he was in the natural twilight of the sun he knew. He was standing upon his own feet, leaning for support against the trunk of a tree, the first of a line of trees all tuned like harp strings, and all of them sang. All of them sang, for it was his 20th birthday today. Everywhere there were morning glories. They girdled him in their blueness, as the maternal arms of the flood once girdled the world. He knew they were blue, for his blind acuteness of touch perceived their color as it had perceived the purple of the orchids that were the banyan's food. But that perception had been exulting in power, and this was pain, for he could not be rid of the sheathing blue that rubbed him raw, his skin with petals, his tongue with blue salt, blue sky scraping his sense of smell. The blue of the fountain wounded his ears, and there was another blue within his heart, coiled crying, but he could not think what it was. He sensed the right way and walked in it, but his progress was slow. He knew neither how far he had come nor how far he had to go. At whiles he thought of Ronnie and mourned her, but this mere beginning of mourning frightened him, with the depth behind it yet waiting to be mourned. Something struck hard against his shin, gashing it, and he fell headlong. Tears soaked his eyes with the smart, but his knowledge-hungry fingers did not hesitate in discovering what lay beneath him. It was a pile of stones placed by human or divine deliberation, retaining heat as though burnt sacrifice had been offered on it, but for one stone pressing against the hollow of his chest that was cold. It was a monument built with purpose, and it was very, very small. It was the length merely of a newly born child. It was the grave marker of a child of his, of every bastard that had ever proceeded from his loins. He questioned which particular death it bleakly heralded, and he was answered before the questioning was complete. But in this moment it could not matter to him whether it were Ronnie's child or Laurie's that here returned to dust. It was his first child and his last. It was all children. It was his own grave. In it he lay entombed, slumbering where he had fallen. Dreams came to him in which he was a tall, brawny youth of the island in a time before the mortifying rain that swept its youth away. He was a man of reverence to whom all men gave heed, and at his bidding they slew their children one by one. But amid his triumph in their obedience, He came face to face with a wave. The numbing chill of nightmare washed over him, and he woke shivering. It seemed to him that someone had called him, but the call caused his shivering to increase, for he knew by the intonation of it that it was not human. And now he heard it again in full wakefulness. "I hail thee, Dominic, honor-bound's captain, leader of men." The words defined him, yet they seemed an accusation, as if to say that in leading he had led astray. It did not now enter his mind to deny it, but before he might confess himself to the priest whose voice rose like Poseidon's from the sea, it addressed him yet again, saying, "What is honor?" It asked him not like Pilate asking what is truth, rhetorically, but because it wished to know. "Honor is that beginning to which I cannot return, that place before the crossing, that time before the dark. I do not know what honor is, but it is meaning. What is meaning?" "You are Dominic," answered the voice, and he answered it again. It is not enough. The voice catechized him further. "What is real?" And he said, "What is real was like a compass tilting, dependent on which way steered. But now it may be that north is always north. It may be, if the name is ever the name and none other, if in the beginning Kailare created the heaven and the earth." Dominic heard the ministerial voice begin to pass away from him, but before it passed wholly he called out to it, "What spirit are you?" "I am the undoer of your lie," its reply was wafted back to him. "Once you boasted falsely that I had spoken with you. Now it is true." Then he heard the voice no more, but he knew to whom it belonged. Messenger of the holy, not answering but by chance to the summons of such as he. Continuing from the grave on his belly, he carried the further blueness of the voice with him like a fin upon his own back, till at last he arrived at remembrance of what blueness curled weeping in his heart. It was the blue of eyes whose immersion he would no longer struggle against, returning him to where he could not return, the same blue of waters that bade him to a nightmareless rest he must soon obey. Crawling through flowers, his eyes grew heavier, but he crawled still till he sensed he had reached another point of transition, a place of good beginning when he should wake to begin again. So, making his bed, now he let the waters ravish him indeed, as he returned to his first night upon the island and gave his love to Lare, now knowing her worthy, knowing his baptism in her to be a grace beyond his will. And in his dream, if dream it was, he said to her as he gave her his child, "I am Dominic," yet now he did not append, whom the gods had blessed, but, "Know me, Lare, know me utterly." And in this new living of that old night, she answered him, but not with the words, "We have a daughter, Dominic," and the curse that came after. Rather, he heard her whisper tiredly into his ear in a perfection of blessing she had labored hard to bring forth, "We have a son." Chapter 34. Love's Ruins. Lare returned from half-dreams to the sight of a son at her breast. Only half could she remember the act of bearing him, and the pain she had forgotten utterly. Though now with her suckling child she was alone in the grotto, it seemed to her that lately she had been companioned, that the salamander itself had ministered to her while she gave birth, and had licked the newborn clean with the tongue of fire. Or perhaps she had only hallucinated. Lying restful now in hibiscus, watching her son sleep and naming him in her heart, she wanted only to remain as she was. Yet there was a thing still to do, the most necessary of all. So tiredly she rose from the sling and passed through the narrow cavern that linked the place of birth with the sanctuary's largest chamber, the chamber of wedding, whose ceiling soared in ornamental tiers not sculpted by man but by the goddess in the beginning. Across this chamber Lare walked halfway, her eyes upon its door, into the cavern of the fountain. There, where once Kayla should have wed her, but instead had cut her throat, she looked upon her son, and she stopped as cold as if the knife stroked her again. It was as though she were seeing him for the first time, and perhaps her eyes had only now recovered from her flesh's separation from his. She looked and saw what she had hoped and prayed against, what she ought to have foreknown had ruinous love not blinded her. The child was sickly, sick unto death. Dominic was not he that is meant. Somewhere, elsewhere, there waited for him a woman. It was hard that she had loved him and not been loved again, but that hardness had been tempered by the chance that he would change to love her. Now she knew that though he did, it would not matter. Perhaps her lot was better than Ronnie's, to have been used carelessly of him not once but ceaselessly. Perhaps it was more blessed than that of the mother of Nika, whose husband had drowned beneath the roaring wages of sin. More blessed it might be, but easier to bear. Once, while standing by the forest pool and witnessing his betrayal, she had said to herself that had she known this to be the end of her surrender to him, she would have surrendered the same. Now she wished to unknow the moment of the past sameness touching the transfiguring future, the moment when Dominic had stepped into her night lamp's circle and quenched the light of her soul. She thought with longing of the centuries in which the others had been hardly a memory, wondered if for all their incompleteness the daughters of Kaialari had not been happier. Of joy it is true there had been little, but what hurt there had been could be endured. Not as this hurt, insufferable to her even as she suffered it. Yet though she could not amid this agony bless love's appearing, Laurie allowed herself to think as she knew she ought not, as she would never again. She thought of a world that the goddess had not chosen but might have made, a world where Dominic, merged in her imagining with the ghost of Kayla, would have stood with her here in the wedding garments, with all the children gathered round. His dark eyes that made her heart sob, seeking her own blue and not turning away. His dark waves like a son of Kaialare's loose about his face. He would take the white cloth twined in his hand and cast it about her, and in that voice disarming and undefended as any she might hear coming from her own child, he would say, "Till death I bind thee to myself, as I myself am bound." Laurie lurched away from that image, but it followed with her even as she walked through the tears to the lover's alcove where he might have led her after they were wed. The children gone to keep torch-lit vigil between the sighing trees through the night, he would lie with her upon the marriage bed, illumined by the changing colors of the sanctuary lamps, and his knowing of her would be love's meaning in time, and the son they conceived its eternity. But now love's sanctuary within her was fallen down in ruins. Her unmeant child, best and dearest promise, was nearly perished. Yet there remained one hope for him, if only she could grasp hold of it beyond the despairing tide that washed over her. She swooned onto the marriage bed with her babe in her arms, not thinking but only feeling until feeling passed away. The sole fruit of her long life was dying, and at long last she too was ready. Gripping its trunk hard to keep himself from slumping groundward, Brian looked up dizzily to the branches of the singing tree. It was a casuarina, Polynesian cypress, the sound of the wind passing through whose leaves resembled the wild notes of an Aeolian lyre. But no wind blew here, and these branches did not counterfeit music, but fashioned it more genuinely than he had ever heard, and fashioned it, it seemed to him, wilfully. As if to prove that seeming, the lowest limbs of the tree bowed themselves down, and swept him lightly forward to the next tree in the row. That tree, too, ushered him on with its twiggy fingers, and the next, and next. Brian envisioned a line of green-clad maids, dryads, or celestial souls that had died virgin, engaging in a dance, passing him from hand to hand. So he was helped along the aisle he could never have walked alone, and the voices of the helpers were as the voices of the rocks of hearing, but nearer as he was now more near to the voice behind them all. And the last tree swept him into a cavern where ferns grew thickly and waters ran. Gazing before him through dimming eyes, he saw nets with hibiscus blooms woven in among them, and in awe he recognized the grotto, the birthing place. He groped along a sling to the fern that upheld it, and then along another, amazed to discover in himself in this final hour a cause for regret. It was not regret for his sins, for he had repented them already. But this sadness, infinitely mild, was because he had not lived to take a wife, to raise up children after him in an understanding of what is good. It would have been a fine thing to do rightly what his father had done poorly, but even as he thought so, he named himself foolish. Not foolish for others to marry and give in marriage, not foolish for them to leave father and mother to cleave to another that would be father and mother together with them, but for himself, Brian David, another way. He saw it suddenly, not acted upon till now because not able, and now too late. He ought to have taken a monk's vows, his only purpose the praise of God. Though my flesh to its shame has known many women, my heart is chaste but for the one that courted me my life long, who turns my prow towards his heavenly consummation from the harbor of this island. Yet there is a thing I must still do, so Ronnie told me, he thought. So she told me, whose heart, for all its wantoning and untouched, is mine. But what can I do when my power is ended, when I cannot put a footfall forward, no longer even crawl? What need will bring movement back, sustain me for another hour? Then from deep within the sanctuary, Brian heard a woman crying as though she cried in her sleep, and a baby crying with her. And that sound and the fountains were one from the other too many steps apart. Dominic woke to the knowledge that he was in the realm of ghosts. He recognized it, for he had communicated in seance with departed spirits, or with demons if such deceived by clothing themselves in cast-off shapes of the dead. He was closely familiar with the nature of those who had nearly strangled him, who named themselves the spirits of night. Yet of all that is called spirit, he knew now that he had trafficked with one side only, the other barely touched. It was that other, terrible in its unacquaintance, that he found himself within. Fearing, yet undeterred by fear, he rose and began to walk, able to anticipate no thing among the infinity of what he might encounter. 10 paces later his forward groping hands met with something hard. It was stone, oddly stinging to the feel. His body's width around, it stretched skyward for the height of him, and past his reach he sensed very far. He made to move from the barrier and walk on, but he was held fast by a voice emanating from inside it. "It is long since I have tasted meat. I know that you are not strong." He sickened at the voice, for he knew it, wishing he did not. He remembered the first speaking of these words, though they had not been paired then as strangely as they were now. Here were ghosts, without doubt. The ghosts were all ghosts of only one, and with that one he was alone, fearfully. But he could not turn back. He continued for 10 paces, 20 more, and his hand struck stone again. This time the ghost did not hesitate so long, but said quickly, "I do not care for what Laurie may tell me. There is nothing left of love for me in the regions of light." Stone after stone, hundreds scattered, each with its own ghost, and he could not escape. No magic avails against weapons self-formed. He had learned the lesson well. Why should the child make a difference? Yes, a bastard. He wished never to have known the voice, to blot it from having been. "I will show you my hand. Think what you will of me, I know what I do." He wished to cut its life thread, never to know it more. Yet as he moved from stone to stone, his despair increasing, it came to him that Laurie moved with him, yet not with him merely, but in him. As he had prayed her in his dreaming to know him utterly, it seemed that in answering she became him completely, walked blindly in his stead, fearing no ghosts, but free of them, not despairing, but sure of where she went. Knowing her present, he walked on in her peace, sensing that he bypassed many stones, many ghosts, not requiring that he face them. Then after a time his hands found one stone more. He breathed in deeply and exhaled Laurie's name. Not shrinking from it, he gripped the stone with his fingers full force. "I seek the fountain, by the 5 wounds of Christ," said his own ghost. And suddenly from behind him he heard horses, thousands upon thousands of them galloping. Their hooves hammered the earth with the strength to split it open. Their thunder ran before them, heralding their flood, and the only way he might save himself was to run faster. Run he did, hesitating for no looming barriers of matter or mind, and none he met. He ran faster than ever a man had, feeling the wind's own spurs drive him forth. They drove him at a speed past breathing, evading the inevitability of his lungs' collapse. Rather he felt himself expanding beyond his measure, more buoyant than vapor, more weightless than air. At last he left the hoof thunder and ghost realm behind, but he ran still, and now on either side of him were voices singing. If the banyan should forsake his brooding solitude to take a wife, so would the bridesmaids sing on the wedding day. And with that thought's inexplicable joy Dominic breathed again, as he ran into moist shade, tripped upon a thing like a net in his sea-chest, and fell. Chapter 35. The Fountain of Life. By the power of a mother and child's weeping, Brian painfully crossed the ground between the grotto and the alcove. There he found Laurie insensible and his captain's son by her, near death. His gently rousing hand sought out her face. "Laurie, dear Laurie, awake! It is time for the baby's baptism." Laurie stirred, but not to reason. "I cannot, for the bleeding," she murmured, grasping at her throat. "Nay, Laurie, but you can. Your scar is healed." The oracle opened her eyes to the truth of what he had told her. By their shock in beholding him, Brian knew how deathly must be his own image. "Brian David, what—" Brian prevented the moment's waste he could not afford. "It was a scorpion, Laurie, but do not grieve, for it is dead, and your child will live. I've come to take you to the fountain, but first I have a thing to give you, or rather to him." From its place of safekeeping inside his boot, Brian drew his mother's letter, 20 years old today. "When he is of an age to understand it, let this be his, for he is the meaning of it. As my mother died to bring life to me, so my purpose in going from the world is that he might be preserved." Laurie took the letter from Brian's hand, and as she did, it seemed to him that whatever infirmity of body or mind had trapped her here while her child's life ebbed, passed away. She rose, cradled the boy in her one arm, and supported Brian with the other. "Come, Brian David," she said, "let us seek the waters of Kyalari together." Feeling that he was leading and being led into the throne room of the unnameable, girdled by consummate grace, Brian walked with Laurie to the chamber of the fountain. At the door of the chamber his courage forsook him, for his sense of his own undeservingness to witness what lay within. But the insistent arm of the oracle, strong with the nearness of her wisdom's source, guided him over the threshold, and not only so far, but to the very brink of the night-blooming flowers that encompassed the glory he dared not behold, and yet he dared not look away. Lifting his eyes and not shielding them, he did behold it, and the beauty of it, in blueness and in light, and the perfection of all vision in the sight of its waters running, so surpassed his dream of it as inspired dreams surpass the dull wakefulness of men without vision. Now that he saw it, he could not say what it meant to him, for all meaning was contained in it, in himself none remaining. He stood ensorcelled by a manner of magic he could only bless, and when Laura's upholding arm slipped from him, he stood unwavering without it. By time untroubled, he wandered through the paradisial mazes of its music. Then a strange voice startled him. It was like the voice of the messenger of the water, inhuman, yet as different in kind from the sharks as from humanity. Its words he could not understand, nor could have had he hailed from anywhere on earth, for they were in a tongue unremembered among men, language's original purity before Babel confounded it. It was the voice of the messenger of the fire, whose golden haze he now saw through the fountain's veil. When the voice ceased, Laurie turned to him, her peerless eyes more earnest than he had known them. "Kyalari has spoken, Brian David. You may enter the fountain and live." He knew by the infinitesimal dwindling of divinity before him what should be his answer. To have heard that offer of love, to know that he was welcomed, was enough. "There is no time for both the child and me. It is my moment to step out, beyond time, and his to render time eternal. If I might have the honor, Laurie," said Brian, and held out his hands. Into them Laurie placed her son, whose incarnating breath was at the point of ceasing. Brian stepped forth among the night-blooming cereus, raised the boy aloft, and plunged him into the welling of the waters. Slowly recovering himself from the shock of his fall, Dominic lay prone, and the netting that tangled him within it was rich with the scent of Laurie and of birth. It came to him that his dream of a son had not been a mere dream, and he desired both the child and the mother more profoundly than ever the secret of life. The song of the fountain swirled around and round him, and he let it carry him toward its vortex, nor minded he how deeply it might drag him down. At length he dimly heard voices, and in among them an infant's feeble cries. He approached them, and the pole of awe that had drawn them before him, yet he felt rather as though it were he that were being approached. He felt the need to shade his eyes, felt it even though his eyes were blind. The spirit that encountered with him gave him no quarter, answering to his protest that he could not abide in its presence. "Yet I abide," and to his whimper that he was not sufficient. "I am that I am." Now the song was so invading that it seemed he must walk in the water's midst, and still he knew that he was not as near as he might be. And now, because timidity held him back, or because the spirit judged that he had intruded far enough, he was stranded wherever it was he stood. He heard a gasp that he knew for Laurie's, but he could not seize it for the harder seizing of himself by a voice as well beloved. It was the voice of Brian David. Despite the tainting of his memory by a book badly twisted, Dominic recognized the words as being somewhere found in the Psalter. The voice, in speaking them, was promoted to angelic height, held to base earth only by bands of heaven's humility. "Thy mercy, O Lord, is in the heavens, and thy faithfulness reacheth unto the clouds. Thy righteousness is like the great mountains, thy judgments are a great deep. O Lord, thou preservest man and beast. How excellent is thy loving kindness, O God! Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of thy wings. They shall be abundantly satisfied with the fatness of thy house, and thou shalt make them drink of the river of thy pleasures. For with thee is the fountain of life. In thy light shall we see light. O continue thy loving kindness unto those who know thee, and thy righteousness to the upright in heart. For with thee is the fountain of life, the fountain of life. With this final repetition, it seemed to Dominic that the mind that ruled the voice began to wander, its thoughts grown too ethereal for mortal speech. He heard the sound of the fountain and of his son crying, and he understood that the one was within the other. Taking a step forward, he heard Brian end, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, in the name of the crucified one, and of Kaialari." Then Dominic sensed a happening of magnitude and mystery, witnessed by him though he could see nothing, known by him though he had forfeited all hope of knowledge in approaching to the fountain. He heard Laurie cry out in anguish, and he heard the voice of Brian issuing not now from on high, but from very low, from just before his feet. "Kneel here next to me, Captain," it said, and then it said no more, and the cry of Laurie continued on into morning. Dominic sank to his knees and reached out his hand. It met with the lifeless hand of Brian David. He traced the hand straight along the arm, across the chest, and the other arm outspread. He remembered the curses that had left his lips to see Brian sleeping so, and he wished the lips cold that the hand he held might return to warm. Here at the heart of all truth he had found a heart of grief, and the grief was for himself, for that he ought not to have found truth only at such a cost. He ought to have been for the sake of the secret, and not the secret for his, and now he willed himself so through the medium of Brian's dead hand. He willed it to the exclusion of all else, so that when the voice of Laurie said unexpectedly, "The fountain, Dominic. If you will enter, you must do it quickly." His mind could barely frame itself to understand her, yet understand he did, and knowing what he did, best of any act of his life, he answered, "I have faced the wrong way." Brian David was dead, not gone with the tide's ebb like a child of Kaialari, but at its peak just ere midnight, and on this remembrance day of his birth. Through the sorrow of that death and the sudden selfhood to which it brought him, Dominic felt the radiant impact and increase of an intense heat, but his eyes could not see what Laurie's saw, how the salamander cast itself into the fountain, and was there immolated and dissolved, how blue drops were marred with sparks of gold, golden earth with azure air, her waters and his consuming fire made inseparable forevermore. Chapter 36. The Bow in the Cloud. Still holding the hand that had forsworn its harmlessness to strike him in Laurie's defense, Dominic arranged the gold of Brian's hair and eased shut his blue eyes. He felt about the boy's neck for the rosary, but it was not there. Laurie's voice knelt beside him. He placed it about Ronnie's neck as she lay dying, and with her it was buried. She asked me to give you her pardon, and to tell you of her prayer that you be blind no more. The oracle hesitated, as if reluctant to add to the weight of the contemplation with which she had already burdened him. But at last she said, "Nika, too, has gone to the grace of the garden of Kaialari." Dominic had thought his grief fathomless and so incapable of increase. Now he knew that the full reckoning of it was deeper yet. "Clement," he whispered, tears stinging him before they came, "good Christ, forgive me, for this also I have done." He felt Laurie's arms go around him, felt the stirrings of the pristine life bound against her heart. He felt fearful of a thing so new, his own self so worn. With that newness and Laurie's agelessness sustaining him, he continued to mourn for an hour over the body of Brian David. Then Laurie said gently, "It is time for our return." Dominic shook his head. "I must wait till I have strength enough to carry him, for I cannot leave him here to corrupt." "He will not corrupt, Dominic, not here. Leave him, and all will be as it should." No longer questioning her authority, he stood to his feet. "You must lead me, Laurie, for I can see nothing, nor have known till now how blind I have always been. My eyes are as yours, but by their light it is you who will lead." So together, his arm lending power and hers lending direction, they passed from the chamber of the fountain, from the aromatic satiety of night-blooming Sirius and the consummation of waters, with that burning element from which they were once estranged. Midway across the chamber of wedding, Dominic's fingers went to Laurie's throat. He could not frame words to express what pain was his, summoned by his own hand. Laurie answered to what he did not speak. "No pain, nor ever again. Our son has baptized it in joy." They passed on, lingering long amid the tranquil beauty of the Fern Grotto, Dominic wishing that they might linger always, for he could not begin to think what he must do when the journey was ended. They walked the avenue of sighing trees, feeling the movement of the air rise slowly from breeze's levity to storm's force. When they reached the border of twilight, the wind brought rain. Dominic gloried in the rain, for that it fell upon Laurie with him, and what voices he now heard within the ghostly land recalled to him only the good he had known and done. Soon then other voices, not spectral, yet not yoked indivisibly to flesh, began to crowd around, the neighings of every horse that has lived and died to enter its own heaven. The neighs were beseechings to mount. Mount he did, and Laurie and the babe behind him, equine muscles hard working beneath, rain driving hard from above, they galloped through the changeless sunset with all the goddess's steeds in their train. At last they came to the far border beyond which the herd would not cross. They slipped to the sand, every hoof's anvil stroke receding from them. Soon, thought Dominic, his elation sinking, I will stumble upon a grave again. Laura's hands pressed against his. The time has come for you to hold our son. Dominic took the child, his heart breaking with the exchange, as awful a thing as ever his hands had done. He held the face of innocence to his and christened it with tears. A drop of water, the fountain's own, still clung upon the child's brow, and it split in twain and spilled into Dominic's eyes. "It is dawn," he heard Laurie whisper, "dawn over all the island." With that brightness that would brook no exclusion, his dark was dispersed. Across the blindness that for 39 weeks had bound him flashed an arc of red, widening to orange, yellow, and green, blue, indigo, and violet, as black retreated into the night that was its proper sphere, never to overbranch the day again. Upon the wild land, the rainforest, and the land of streams the advancing sun shone, and here upon the sacred peninsula in his newborn sight. Its beams pierced the cloud that drenched him with the tears of Kailare, and the bow of its creating was a promise that the tears were no more of judgment, but of love as the whole fulfilling of divine law. Dominic saw, first the rainbow, then the sun he yet held in his hands. He turned to Laurie, with eyes making clear that he saw her too. His own tears merged with rain upon her face. When many moments later Dominic found his voice, he wished it might be for a prayer of thanksgiving, but he knew that Laurie understood when he could only ask, "Brian held the child within the fountain and was touched by its virtue. Why is he then dead while I— For no two that she has made is the meaning of Kailare the same." "I know so little of her," said Dominic, with unbounded regret. "And I am her oracle," answered Laurie, smiling and taking her son again. As she bore him upon the golden trail with the blue shark keeping pace with the shore, as she carried him to his destiny from the fountain of life back through the spirit gateways, she unfolded to his father all the history of Kailare's children at last. Chapter 37. Last Things. At the hour the Tahitians call Tuirapo, at midnight, Laurie sat upon the earth in the place of jubilation, and Dominic sat beside her, watching while she gave their child suck. Their eyes, when not on the child or one another, were drawn toward the stars, for every way else they looked brought them pain. They had emerged that noon from the passage in the rock, and what they had seen would, if it were possible, have killed all their joy, caused Dominic to wish that his curse of blindness had never been lifted. His dark eyes withstood the shock of a self-guilt akin to Adam's forever barred from a world unfallen, her blue the ruin of 40 centuries of beauty remembered, the only world she had known. I, the oracle, should have been prepared, thought Laurie, her son imbibing the spirit of the fountain in mother's milk. Though the Banyan's eclipsing power kept its throne only 2 nights and a half and 2 days, yet no garden whose food is light could live unnourished for so long. The island was withered, but for the sacred peninsula where the tree had held no sway. Its fruits and flowers had sickened, soon to expire. Its birds sang not, but for one plaintive note in an hour. Eels floated upon their backs in pools gone stagnant. Flying foxes hung paralyzed from dying branches, falling one by one with the leaves. Wild pigs rooted feebly for a few heartbeats and gave up the search for sustenance. Dogs crept upon their bellies from shrub to shadeless shrub, at last to drown their sadness in dreams of what was lost. The banyan spewed back heavenward the whole store of light it had devoured, and turned the poison of its shame inward upon itself. Yet her child lived, and Dominic lived, and Clement, and despite the funereal proceeding of all that surrounded them, this was reason for hope. With this she had comforted Dominic for his blame in the island's death, attempted to do him the last service of steering him towards the future from where his mind lay stranded upon the shore of regret. It was hard to steer him so. For 14 years and more he had fixed upon the future too much. The fountain and its secret had been his goal unalterable by persuasion or force, and it was soon for him to see another end as his. But her two old eyes would exert their final strength to sharpen his unfocused newness to clarity. She waited for him to speak the words himself. When at length he did not, she said, "It is best, Dominic, to stay no longer, but to depart from the island at dawn." "Depart," he murmured, "depart." Laurie shivered within his voice depths of desolation. "From the birthing place of the only knowledge that has not played me false, from the mother of what little in me I do not hate, it would be all one as if our son were forbidden to seek your breast again. And yet it must be." "Why? Why must it? Though I among all men should be last to question now. Paradise is raped, and that at my own hand. But is not the sacred peninsula a broad enough home in which for us to dwell? You and I and the child and Clement, and our children yet to come. Before we grow to too many, the island's purity may be restored. Clement would not be among us, he chafes to be gone. Then, though I would weep for his loss, he may take the honor bound and gather himself new friends where he can." Laurie shook her head slowly and smiled. "Not even in death will you and he be parted. The sacred peninsula is a place to journey, not to abide, and it cannot support any life but the spirit's, for no food springs there. The nakedness of the island will never be reclothed as we have known it, though reclothed it may be." "Then we must depart indeed." "Yes, Dominic. We must leave at dawn." Dominic looked to far distances, his eyes penetrating mists, only to find mystery beyond them. "And where and to what purpose will we sail? I ought to know what I must do, but I do not. I have heard it once, but the memory teases me from just beyond my reach." "It may be," Laurie answered, "that aboard your ship the answer will come to you. It may be that you need only to take the first step. The beginning and the end are in the hands of Laurie." Dominic laid his hands upon hers and held the child. "Her hands and yours are one to me. If it is their love that holds my meaning, I am content." Then Laurie gave him the babe, and from where it was bound in her waistcloth she drew Brian's letter. "Take this, Dominic, and keep it, for it must be his when he is old enough to understand." Dominic took it and read it. "I did not know," he whispered brokenly. Then, "Brian's death will not be in vain, for the child shall be great." "Yes," Laurie affirmed, "he shall be great. His mother herself shall read these words to him when he is ready." But to this Laurie did not reply. "And what," asked Dominic suddenly, "shall our son be named?" Laurie thought how, but for the last thing she could not yet bring herself to tell him, he had come to be in union with her, for it was this naming that she had been about to speak. "It may be that one day he will need another name, more suited to his place and time. But the name which I, as one among the children, would bestow upon him now and here is Kaya, for that is how she, who shares with both of us her name, has moved me. Kaya his name shall be, for you and he together have defined for me all that is holy. But now, is there aught you would take with us when we go? For me there is only the coat of my uniform and my sea chest. But if you wish to seek further for mementos, we must do it soon, or else strengthen ourselves with sleep." Laurie knew that the moment had come. "You and Kaya will leave with Clement at dawn, but I will not." Dominic frowned. "Do not mock me, Laurie, for the devil that yet struggles to own me will not endure it. Never have I mocked you, nor will. But my life is bound to the islands, and with it I belong while life lasts." "Laurie, Laurie, hush! Could I bear what you are telling me, could I suffer the loss of you only to myself, this would not be the only loss. There is no food left upon the island, so you have said. To leave you here would be to leave you to your death." "And do you not think, after these thousands of years, that it is time? Where I was once, there I yearn to be again. I think that it is wrong, if with error I may chide an oracle, for you to seek death out. I think that what is meant for you is to be with me for as long as your mistress allows. With this understanding only will I bow to your leading, for if you will not come, Laurie, I will not go." As he waited on her answer, Laurie turned her vision upon his path between now and eternity, and she did not see herself there but what for her was in the keeping of her son. There were others than she that had the final right of claim on him, and she had hoped that he would have seen this as she had seen it in the sign of Kaya's being born unhealable but for the fountain's mercy. Yet his eyes would seek her first as long as she walked with him, and perhaps if only for so long it was meant to be. "Go, Dominic, with this understanding. I will be with you for as long as Kaya Laurie allows." Then Dominic loosed a part of the length of the white tapa in which Kaya was swathed, and cast it around her. "Till death I bind thee to myself, as I myself am bound to Kaya Laurie." And Laurie answered, "Till death." Then he helped her to rise, and, the babe in her arms again, he stood behind them with his arms enfolding her. He did what he had wished to do once at the rocks of Hearing. What, had he done it then, might have spared Ronnie and Nika so soon a heaven and himself a 40 weeks' hell. He crowned her head with a kiss. "Know me, Laurie, know me utterly." She knew him, and he her, and their child was that knowing. As from the place of jubilation they turned their eyes back skyward, the majesty of the steed and the might of the Southern Cross twined themselves together, and where there had been sundered glory there was one. Chapter 38. A Tide Out of Time. From the midst of the lagoon and the deck of the honor-bound, Dominic, ship's captain, looked his last at the island. He could not conceive that in an hour its image would be forever confined to memory. In his 9-month sojourn he had seen it too little. Nor would 90 years of lucid vision have been enough. To walk, if but once, the land of streams and the southern desolation, to celebrate the rainforest with other than a sorcerer's greed, and contemplate in mystic fulfillment the wonders of the sacred peninsula, all without time's harpies at his back. This is how he would choose to wear out the remainder of his days. This is how he would have wished his destiny shaped, had his hand not struck the island's immortal cheek and sent time reeling. Now all was ready for embarking. Before daybreak they had made their preparations, gathered what little food was salvageable for use until their next landfall, perhaps on an island of the dangerous archipelago, though no course had yet been charted. Clement had retrieved his mandolin, and had woven white moss roses to crown him in farewell. Laurie had broken a shard from the rocks of Hearing, but for this and Kaya she carried with her only the clothing she wore. Dominic had taken his sea-chest, and had sought out the coat of his uniform in the hut of Ronnie. There he had found Nappy, nestled in the coat, asleep. He had been loath to disturb the animal, so near it was to drawing its last breath, but as gently as he eased the coat from beneath it, the dog had waked, and had cried out almost humanly at being deprived of the sense remembrance of its mistress's love. To be the cause of even so much more pain was to Dominic unendurable. Kaya will need a playmate, he had reasoned, and Nappy became the final passenger on a second ark fleeing from death's ruin. Now the grating of the oarlocks on the boat's last trip from shore to ship had faded even in echoes. Now dawn was risen, the phantom moon yet tarrying for a time in the sun's domain. Now the anchor was hoisted, the sails trimmed and catching the wind. The ship went about and glided dreamwise toward the breach in the reef. Dominic watched the coral sands recede. Clement also turned his gaze from where he manned the helm, and in both their ears the fountain sang its sorriest song. But Laurie with Kaya in her arms faced eastward and did not bid the west good-bye. Dominic was plucked from music's tearful immersion by Laurie's hand. "I know that your ship needs all your attendance," she said, "but will you hold Kaya until we reach the open sea? I long to commune with your wooden lady, for she and I have an acquaintance that is very old." Dominic was not certain of her meaning, but permitting her to kiss each of his fingers in turn as though they were priceless relics, he took his son from her, and also at her urging, the shard of the rocks. As he watched her walk from him toward the prow, he thought of how nobly among women she graced the deck on which never before he had suffered a woman's feet. He had scorned her sex as purposeful tools, but the oracle was a tool for the purposes of a power in whose hands he himself yearned only to lie ready. Laurie reached the figurehead and inclined her black hair to stream against its gold. Almost Dominic called her back, for the sight of his first love's portrait so linked with his last roused a troubling in him that he could not order still. Yet there was a rightness in that linkage he dared not to snap apart. Laurie was telling secrets into the figurehead's ear. He strained to capture them for his own, and could not. He was vaguely aware that Clement sought his counsel, that the honor-bound had come to the breach and gone suddenly dead in the water. But he could heed now neither his ship nor his chaplain, for in the voice achingly clear and pure he heard the figurehead speak. Separate from hers as a twin's might be, yet it was the voice of Mariel. "My child is as yours, and yours is as mine," it answered in an ecstasy of triumphant release. "You have bound me to honor again." On the winging feathers of that cry, Dominic's folly came home to roost. He remembered how, in a fever of magic lust, he had pronounced a word over the wooden lady, frivolously, thinking only of the challenge of impressing life upon the void. He had pronounced it, and passed it on to other encantings, never minding the outcome amid his passion of sheer act. Now he knew that he had waylaid a birth-bound soul into an incarnation for which no soul was meant, and he felt his own limbs stiffening like trees in terrible empathy. But he had no time to allow the feeling its proper damning weight, for in that moment two fearful things happened at once. The figurehead spoke again, now one word only, but it was the word of her own creation. In the aftermath of its stunning vibrato, Laurie cried out, for it was the lost word of Kayalare, forgotten from before the flood, comprehending both she and he. This Dominic could not know, but at its impact a tremor coursed through him. It seemed to him that the figurehead's woodenness softened fleshward, and Kaya cooed in an ancient language in his sleep. Dominic deemed that the eyes and ears of him were going mad. He turned to Clement, seeking confirmation of his sanity or its rejection, but Clement's gaze was toward the island, his emotion so far passing fear that man has given it no name. Dominic looked behind. From beyond the western shore there surged toward them a great wave. As it approached, it swelled in height till its crest met with the overarching sky and ran out of sight. O'er the island it loomed, and for the island it had come. In its awful depth Dominic beheld how gross a violence to time had been done. It was the first wave, and it was the last, which had avenged the death of many children and would confer honor on the salvation of one. It was the wave that had claimed Kayla, and the one that would claim... Dominic turned his back to it, and with the arm he could free from Kaya reached toward the prow. "Laurie!" he shouted, his voice ringing hollowly as in a tunnel. But there remained no time in which his arm might follow where his voice had led. The wave had roofed the mast and quenched the sun that beat upon it, and all the ship but the prow was enthralled in a whirlwind of water. Her captain and holy man clawed wildly at their ears as those who hear sirens sing. It seemed to Dominic that there were voices within the wave, not of those who had drowned in the deluge's wrath, but countless spirits like the choirs of heaven chanting alleluias, and there were voices of beasts such as had humbled themselves to carry him in the land of twilight, and, deafening, the drumming of hooves. All the water had shaped itself into the appearance of horses, and these so raced each on the heels of the next that they merged into one horse. Laurie raised her face from where it rested upon the figurehead, and leaving her one hand on the hair of gold, lifted the other like a priest in ministry before the sacrament. "Behold the steed of Kayalare," she prayed, and as the words went from her lips, the horse reared and the wave poured down. All was tumult and white foam, then silence. Somewhere years onward into the silence, Dominic came to himself. The wave had re-entered its mother sea. He stood on his ship's deck, bodily and whole, and Clement clenched its helm, and Kaya was within his arm, and Nappy beside him. But without turning he knew that the island was gone, and looking straight on he saw the prow without its figurehead. And gone with her, but for the lingering image of oracle hands riding the foam like an unfettered captive spurring homeward, was Laurie. She had gone with the ebb tide, and the ebb that was the flood. Not as the child of Ronnie that had been too much his, gone at noon's high even as he had gone to the crossing. Not as the motherless child he held had nearly gone at high midnight, Brian taken in its stead. She had gone as the children were meant, and the millennia between Noah's time and this were gone in a single moment's rise and fall. Gone were those centuries no magic could recall. But as he turned at last to see the island sunken indeed, his heart's churning was not only of sorrow, for beneath translucent azure and emerald the island lived again, reborn as an underwater kingdom. He beheld every beauty in oceanic permutation, the vale of flowers, the banyan, the forest pool, the rocks of hearing, the hallowed summit and its falls down amid ramiform corals, whorled shells, and denizen of tentacle, spine, and fin. The cone was there, breathing forth fire encased in glowing bubbles. The spirit gateways were there, sapphire trumpets, ruby twilight, ferns dancing upon currents that hastened toward the point where waters delight to gather. The fountain alone showed above the surface, brimming cloudward in blue-gold showers and raining back into the waves, and within it was the salamander reformed. The animals were there, become aqueous. Winged foxes and birds of eye-startling plumage flittered through a liquid sky, and sea-dogs and sea-pigs bayed and grunted in glee whose sound was swallowed before it reached him. But more wondrous far than these, within the reef arms of the island's lagoon, swam a mermaid. Dominic recognized her as having broken from the poverty of mirroring his own person, created anew in the image of a more abundant God. The glory of the tale was new to his seeing, for it had been hidden in wood, but he knew her by her once sad green eyes and golden hair. And seeing how the figurehead, the island and its creatures, had been transfigured, he searched till his eyes were weary for a trace of Brian David. But the soul of Brian had gone another way, and with it Lares, and there was no need of them to spring again in that submarine paradise. Too timeless were they to be netted in transient gardens. But as Dominic looked back eastward and gave his entranced helmsman the command to steer on, he caught sight to starboard of a blue shark pacing with the ship along the path of the wind. Chapter 39. First Things. Though he had plucked them so many hours ago, the roses were not withered. The full white blooms athwart his brow consoled him, with the memory of Nika's coronating him with blooms like these, once at their coming together, and once again at their sundering. He was glad for the consolation. The friend that might have salved his pierced heart now had greater need of healing than he, and he could not bestow what he himself had not. It could not be long before he was called upon to perform his chaplain's office for that single soul left within his care. He was ready to forget himself for that other, for he had found his understanding. Though forearmed in vision and by 100 signs else he had heeded it, yet for the death of Nika he grieved, and would mourn her always. But the he that mourned was another he than had first knit hands with her. He had sensed his entry within the island's reef as final, and he had not been wrong, for he had departed it a different man. All the subtler meanings of their union, the reason of their child's taking before its birth, these his mind confessed it did not wholly comprehend. But he knew that had she never lived, his soul must finally have strayed into perdition, and had she not died, he would not willingly have entered again the path of the purgatorial winds whose work in him was yet undone. But for her loss he would not have found the secret wherein his future rested, which rested for its fulfilling until his captain should find it the same. "Clement!" From within the ship's dank and shadowy belly, Dominic called him. Clement descended as into the weedy hell of Jonah's whale, knowing that here also was a man prisoned in confusion. After the initial energy of his flight from the place of Lares' drowning, Dominic had found himself suddenly unable to gird his will to go on. Sequestered alone in his cabin, he now permitted the honor-bound to drift aimlessly at the mercy of the tides. Yet the aim would come, and the office of Clement was to strengthen it when it came. From tropical noon the chaplain passed into a dimness broken only by the weak light of tallow candles. Beneath a compass rolling chancefully as dice, Dominic sat with his head face downward upon his desk. Spread about him haphazardly were charts upon which a myriad notations had been scratched hurriedly, only to be effaced, overwritten by a bewilderment of compass roses clustered together like a riotous bouquet. Lying atop the charts were the shard of the rocks of hearing, the letter of Brian David in his book. The book was open to Isaiah, the 47th chapter, and underscored in red ink was the verse that ran, "Stand now with thine enchantments, and with the multitude of thy sorceries, in which thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be thou shalt be able to profit, if so be thou mayest prevail." On Dominic's bunk, blanketed by the coat of his uniform, Caius slept with Nappy standing watch. Dominic raised his head. "The shark, Clement. Does it stay with us?" Clement sat beside him. "Yes, Dominic. It drifts, as the ship drifts." The hope in the captain's dark eye flickered out. "I had thought that it might lead me, but it waits for me to take the way before it. Help me, Clement. Help me. I am lost." "You are more true upon your path than when you were certain you saw its end. Do not yield to despair, for he that seeks will find." Dominic shook his head and gestured vaguely about his ears. "There are too many voices claiming that their path is mine. I cannot sift them to know the chaff from the wheat. The one that might have spoken clearly is gone under the wave. And has Laurie left you nothing of her wisdom to speak to you as she would have spoken? She would have told me to follow the wisdom of Kyalari. I know now, Clement, who Kyalari is. The very Lord God you have always preached. I can usurp the pretense of that lordship to myself no longer. But though I seek in his book and find direction, there is none to my present need. And the shard of the rocks was Kaya's talisman, not my own. But Clement," he went on, his voice falling to an awed whisper, "when I lay my hand upon the shard I do hear voices, but they are not the voice of God. I hear Ronnie, as when I told her of my bastard daughter, she answered me, 'I knew a man who thought he cared for children, and yet I saw at last that he cared nothing at all.' I hear the figurehead crying to Laurie, 'My child is as yours, and yours is as mine.' And Clement, I hear the voice of Mariel. In the night of the banyan, in the midst of my blindness, a vision or a ghost of her came to me at the forest pool. 'Love is the fulfilling of the law,' she said, as you have, and she said that I might save Scarlet from dying of fever if I would do what she once told me long ago. The children, Clement, the one here sleeping with a high destiny upon him, and the one languishing oceans away, the law is written in the very prints of their fingers, if I could read. Do you care for them, Dominic? Do you love them? To the wonder of me, who thought I cared nothing at all, yes, with all my wicked heart. Whose child is the figurehead's? Unless it be Mariel's, I do not know. What was it that she told you long ago?" Dominic beat his breast with his fist. "I cannot recall, not to save myself, to save my daughter. Think, Dominic, long ago, what was it that she said to you in departing?" "She said that she had found life's secret in me. And afterwards, was there not a letter?" Slowly, as though each fragment of the motion caused him pain, Dominic unlocked a hidden compartment in his desk and drew out a yellowed paper tied in blue ribbon, sealed with an M, and smelling of roses still. He laid the letter in Clement's hand. "How long has it been, Dominic, since you have read this?" 13.5 years since the day it reached me at the Golden Horn." Clement returned the letter to its intended. "Read it now." He watched Dominic read, and saw illumination warring in his face with the obscurity that was its silhouette image. At last the captain asked, "Is this the voice, then, Clement? Can it be?" "It can be, and is." "How long have you known this?" "Since the day of Nika's death." For some time Dominic was silent, while the shadow image still contended, yet receding to vanishing. At last, not in objection but only in observation, "The rope across the moon. We will hang, Clement." "Yes, they will hang us as deserters from the gallows." "Is the nation right to bid us fight its battles unthinking?" "Not unthinking, never that. Yet though the nation is not always right, we are right to honor it, for it keeps within its care much that we are right to love, and the homing place of our spirits is there. And do we do this only because we have no reason left to live? We do it to preserve life for what reason we have. Then we must return." It was resolved, and Clement knew that it would not be questioned again, for it was the seeker's gift that when he knew what he sought, he could not be misled to the right hand or the left away. Dominic looked at Kaya, and let his eyes linger. "Mariel is obedient to the good, loving as a woman can be. When I have done what she asked, I know that she will do what I must ask her." He said no more in explanation, but Clement thought he understood. Then, still gazing at Kaya tenderly, "He will need a second name to wear as a citizen of the nation, but it must be a name as true to his meaning as his name among the children. What is the passage, Clement, that you have so often quoted me?" "I have quoted many, self-righteous Pharisee, hypocrite that I have been. The one that speaks of Scarlet." Clement turned the pages of Isaiah to chapter 1, and pointed Dominic to the 18th verse. "Come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool." As white as snow. In Latin, alba means white. I have named him Alban. And now, as my chaplain, I have one thing more to ask you. Baptize me, Clement." Clement smiled. "Were you not christened when you were a babe? Then there is no need. Though your father and mother brought to you that water only for the sake of others' judgment and not in their own faith, God knew then what would be your desire when you came to this day. And yet, as your chaplain, there is a thing I can do for you now that your heart is confirmed. There is another sacrament." Opening the holy receptacle he had in foresight brought with him, he drew from it a wafer and placed it in Dominic's hand. And as his captain took the body of Christ, Clement measured out the wine. Chapter 40. Honor Bound. "We have a daughter, Dominic. I have named her Scarlet. Please come home to her. Marielle." The trade winds ruffled the coat of his uniform. The sun struck golden sparks from its epaulets, and both penetrated him, branding in his being the words he would never more forget. They would run their unceasing circuit in him until his eyes met hers again, as the running of the fountain of life would resound still in his hearing at the hour of his death. That hour was not yet, but now also was a season of farewell. For the dead women of the children of Kyalari the waters knew best how to intone eulogies, and the two that listened gave heart's somber affirmation in silence. But Brian David had been a ship's officer and a citizen of the nation, and something more must for him be done. They had not his body to stitch into his hammock, place on a plank laid across the bulwarks, and tip into the sea as the custom was. They had only his sword, which he had turned against no man. This they wrapped in a shroud of canvas, weighted with cannonballs to sink it like Excalibur. Over the sword Clement pronounced the words of the service of burial, then left it to his captain to speak. "Man that is in honor and understandeth not is like the beasts that perish." Dominic prayed, "Receive, O Lord, the spirit of one who understood." The shroud went under the waves, and Dominic leant long over the starboard side, gazing after it. Then he looked to where the rose orchids and the red ginger sprang up from the ocean's floor, to where it seemed to him that the welling of the fountain enkindled the horizon. "Why, Clement," he asked, "why was the secret found among Polynesian blossoms, in the strange eyes of an oracle, and not in the flowers plucked from the earth of my own parish by the hands of Marielle? Was it only my sin's necessity, or is there yet another meaning?" Clement laid his hands upon Dominic's shoulder. "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are his ways than ours, and this is only to say that we cannot know. I too have come a wearisome long way to discover that a warship will lead me at last to peace, the nation's bondage to freedom, and that the misfortune of a tightening noose will prove most fortunate of all. I know only that the purging winds which I have cursed are become blessed to me, for they are the winds of my home, the temporal and the eternal. And I know that an oracle sun will carry on the meanings of those we mourn, and of us who for a while remain." So into the wind's path they turned their naked prow, not at once to eastward, but first to venture once more within the waters of the archipelago, and there regather as many of the honor-bound's crew as the redeemed power of Dominic could persuade to join them in happy fatality. There also, in a sad-eyed widow and mother of a stillborn child, they would find a wet nurse for Kaya, preserved by the life received at Lare's breast until he might feed again. With them journeyed the shark, which centuries after would be a matter of wonder to the foes and friends of Kaya Alban. The time would come when this man championed by a strange dog, who gleaned revelation from a shard of rock, and spoke to a fish, and was answered, and carried with him always a crumbling epistle from a mother to a son. The time would come when he of the darkling hair and uncanny blue eyes, who harked to a music no other could hear, and seemed never to die, would fulfill his destiny in a world that needed him, at an hour when signs in the sun and moon would perplex the nations of earth, foundering in distress as one, voices of waves roaring forth the prophecy of the end of ends. The time would come when he, known for the oracle he was to the multitudes or only to the angels of God, would make meaning of his father's long seeking, and of the 4,000 years from the deluge his mother lingered beyond her kind. But that time and that meaning were untold generations away. Now as the ship, in which the oracle lay sleeping, began its brief voyage to the cloud of islands, honor-bound beneath the Pleiades' guardian eyes, Clement, white-crowned from his place at the helm, broke forth in song. I pitch my tent in hell where to search out heaven's stair. I spoil the draught of paradise, yet when with plundering hands I sift its dregs, I find thy waters there. I seek in shades to robe mine eyes, bid darkness blanket me. But when the night I conjure falls, my blinding comes by deluge, not by dearth. Thy dawn is all I see. Though death destroy this wanton flesh, my path to thee lies plain. And when fire's flood has me o'erwashed, no soul seed less than pearl will rise to flower within that gentle rain. Thine is to give and take away, mine is to bless thy name. As seaward draws the ebbing tide, the hand that seems to sever life at last bequeaths to me the same. I pitch my tent in hell wherefrom to search out heaven's stair. I spoil the draught of paradise, yet when the plunging hands I sift its dregs, I find thy waters there. I seek in shades to robe mine eyes, bid darkness blanket me. But when the night I conjure falls, my blinding comes by deluge, not by dearth. Thy dawn is all I see. Though death destroy this wanton flesh, my path to thee lies plain. And when fire's flood has me o'erwashed, no soul's seed less than pearl will rise to flower within that gentle rain. Thine is to give and take away, mine is to bless thy name. As seaward draws the ebbing tide, the hand that seems to sever life at last bequeaths to me the same. Dominic, while his friend sang, spilled the contents of his sea-chest into the deep. Then he sought his cabin, there to compose a letter to Mariel. Epilogue. At dawn. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. T.S. Eliot, Little Gidding. Quote, Mariel, I thank the God you have always known that we have a daughter, and I am coming home to her. Beyond this thanks and this act, 15 years too slow, I can make no reparation for my breach of the troth between us. I can only say that I have been as one who walked in sleep, who now awakened beholds what manner of man he has always been. I am Dominic, I decreed vaingloriously, as though it were in my power, like the word of creations, to shape myself from nothing. Had I looked with clear sight on the image reflected in you that are meant for me, if I had rejoiced with the love of my youth and made her my wife, I would not have sought to strangers for the secret that embraces the truth of me and all others within. But I have been blinded, and so it is that when you see me returning with the rising of the sun, it will be to marry you, to give our daughter my blessing, and then to die. As I thank the good Christ for Scarlet, so I give thanks to your unfailing charity, by whose strength you will raise up to manhood her half-brother. The mother of him, twin to you in worthiness, was like you also in the cruel wrong she received at my hand. Now she is taken from the world to range the paths of a garden where I too am going soon. But Kaya, her son and mine, that shall be yours, will tarry long after us, for he is a peculiar child. Baptized in the fountain of life, in him the spirit of those waters remains. She woke with his letter still clasped in her hand, her heart quaking for the fear that dawn might have come and gone and she had failed to meet him. Then she perceived that the world lay yet in darkness, but she did not stay abed to remember her dreams. She rose, tiredly joyful as on a morning nigh 15 years ago after giving birth, laved her face, donned her one good dress, and hid the letter in its sleeve. About her throat she fashioned a cloak whose hood was sewn with tiny silver bells. She arranged her golden hair, whitening at the temples, then seated herself on that side of her bed where another had slept. Her fingers caressed the ringlets of her same color scattered slumberous on the pillow. "Scarlet, sweet one, wake. This is the day your father and brother come home to us." Scarlet stirred, unsealing dark eyes that were her father's own, brightening hopeward. Mariel helped her to clothe herself prettily as a scant wardrobe would allow, thinking the while of how near she had approached to losing her. Scarlet had been ill unto death with fever, and the physician's nostrums had done nothing for her. Then, on the last day it seemed she might tarry in life, Dominic's letter had arrived, and the glad expectancy and the impossible wonder of its contents pouring from her mother's trembling lips had begun her healing. Together, hand in hand, the near-grown woman and the woman no longer young departed their lodgings, and walked quickly through the brisk, sea-damp air toward the wharf and the docking-place where once Mariel had let a letter fly from her hand in the wake of a warship that had borne away her future, that now bore it back. As she walked, silently for the fullness neither she nor her daughter could express, she thought always of that other letter, the one secreted in her sleeve which she would let none but death part from her. She thought of the marvel its many pages had confided to her alone of any living, the history and fate of an island immersed under waves, but flourishing still where the 120th meridian crosses the Tropic of Capricorn. She thought of a boy to whom she must one day unfold these mysteries, Alban to the world, Kaya to his sister and to her, the rare treasure of whom was committed to their care. Some might judge that caretaking of another woman's child bitter, but she, who had let herself be bedded without the bond of wedding, even while knowing she ought not, had yet each day blessed the good in girl's flesh that had issued from that too hasty union. And so she would daily bless in the name of Lare, her adopted son. She thought with awe of rearing one who would be counted among the prophets, and thence her heart spun back to its magnetic north, to once more see his face, no longer 25, but 40 years aged, to feel the empowering tenderness of his arms around her, and fuse with him once in a kiss as his very wife, to see his eyes shed love upon his daughter before the gallows tree translated their light to heavens. To do these things within one brief hour in them and know the life of him again, would armor her to watch him die, knowing that death for him was the only honorable end. The wharf was reached. The sun ran swiftly to its rising, but still there was no sign of his ship. Long-suffering others, that had chosen as she to meet the honor-bound's crew in disembarking, Mercy's own few, fixed anxious gazes on the horizon, with those of the nation's guarantors who would bind fast its prodigal children when they came ashore. Mariel looked toward Scarlet, and smiled ruefully to see her, beauteous as the dawn itself, exchange enamored glances with a handsome naval captain. Then turning the other way, her glance lighted on a bowed old man, garbed in the somber weeds of the Puritan clergy. The old man's tear-filled eyes met her green ones. "I am here to meet my son," he said, his voice laden with the immeasurable love and sorrow of Mary at the cross. "My son, my son Clement, who was lost to me and now is found." "I know of him," Mariel answered gently. "He is a good man." "Yes," confirmed the other. "Unstable as water I judged him, but to the thirsting lips of my drought-humbled soul he is excellent as the waters of life. And you, daughter, why have you ventured here so early?" "I am here to meet my Mariel began, but could not complete the lie, though such a man as this would surely shun her when he heard the truth. "I am here to meet the father of my child. She is a bastard." The trace of a disdaining frown shadowed the old man's face, dissolving quickly, like habitual melancholy subdued by the practice of joy. He laid his knobbly withered hand upon her arm. "Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. But how fare you in this unforgiving world, my daughter? Have you enough? I am a sempstress, and earn our only living so. We are poor, but we have enough." "You shall have enough, and more, while I live, and when I have returned naked to him that supplies my daily bread. The Lord is your shepherd, as he is mine, and he commands me that you shall not want." To this miracle of charity Mariel was not sufficient to reply. Instead, she took the old man's hand within her free one. Dawn's red flame flared higher, and from its smoldering heart shot the sails of a ship. 3 generations linked watched the white swell in bulk against the scarlet. When the honor-bound was near enough to see men upon her deck, and yet too distant to distinguish their features, Mariel felt a wave of retreating night flow back over her. "They will hang," she cried despairingly, and buried her face in the old man's shoulder. Like the thieves on either hand of the Christ. But this time it will be to both that he will promise in that hour, "Today shalt thou be with me in paradise." Parting her head from the shroud of his black clothes, Clement's father steered her gaze back toward the sun. And now indeed she saw faces, and in among them the one she sought. The face of a dog barking ecstatically at his side, the face of an infant he cradled in his arms. She saw a chaplain's face beneath white roses, weeping praiseful songs. She saw the face of a blue shark leading the ship's prow in. Knowing the end from Dominic's letter, she counted the absence of her wooden likeness following not loss but gain. And as her eyes bound themselves to his and Scarlet's fingers tightened in happiness around her hand, she heard as though it were her own tears' voice a jubilation of waters. Heaven's windows flung themselves wide, turning the sky fully golden. Everywhere around her was the glory of morning.